and welcome to Something's Off with Andrew Heaton. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton. I love Broadway musicals, and in particular, I love 1776. It's a fun, jaunty show that's approximately like if Gilbert and Sullivan were trying to explain the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Although there's a few things the musical leaves out. Here's one. In Philadelphia, in 1776, between licensed and unlicensed taverns, there were 10 times as many places to drink per citizen as there are now. Meanwhile, up in New York, back then there were enough bars that every denizen of the city could drink simultaneously. Perhaps because during the Revolutionary War, the average American drank an estimated 6.6 gallons of absolute alcohol every year. That's 5.8 shots of 80-proof liquor per day for every adult, which in that era is 15 years old. Let me repeat that. Everyone in the country was drinking upwards of 6 shots of Southern Comfort, or the equivalent, when we kicked out the stuffy old Brits in 1776. In that great play, 1776, starring Mr. Feeney from Boy Meets World, or in the newer version, Brent Spiner, who played Data on Star Trek, there's a brief reference to prostitutes. Benjamin Franklin, clearly excited, but it doesn't quite convey the sexual libertine environment you would have stepped into if you'd visited one of those taverns. The grandson of William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, married a prostitute and seemed to get along just fine in high society. Guess how many women were prosecuted in Philadelphia in 1760s and 1770s for prostitution? Guess. You got that number in your head? How many women were prosecuted for prostitution, Philadelphia, 60s and 70s of the 18th century? It was 3. Just 3. So basically, at the time of our founding, America was Las Vegas with powdered wigs. I learned all of that from Thaddeus Russell's book, A Renegade History of the United States, which we will talk about momentarily. I enjoyed the work, and at the same time, I have never felt so uncomfortable about my own bougie sensibilities and Norman Rockwell upbringing. 50 years ago, American history was mostly taught as a series of great men doing great things. History consisted of a chain of biopics. A lot of modern-day historians see American history as more or less a clutch of aristocratic white males presiding over a nation of bigoted religious zealots, and history is the gradual climbing out of that pit towards something better. Conversely, a number of conservatives see the founding era as one of morally upright Christian patriots and a subsequent apostasy from the holy republic they established. Thaddeus Russell has a very different way of looking at history. From what I can tell, he sees American history as a battle between disciplinarians and libertines, between schoolmarms and drunks, Puritans and whores. And I'm excited to have him on. But before we jump feet first into America's delightful history of drunks and streetwalkers, we do need to pay those bills. And that means a word from our sponsor. Something's Off with Andrew Heaton is brought to you by Beef Smoothies from Liquid Meats Incorporated.
When you go for a jog and you need a quick boost, beef smoothies are the way to go. Nothing revs you up like chunky liquid fight meat. Beef smoothies are the way to go. Chug beef smoothies when you need some protein. Drink beef smoothies in your mouth and into your veins.
Beef Smoothies from Liquid Meats Incorporated. It's raining meat. My guest today is Thaddeus Russell. He is the author of A Renegade History of the United States and a number of interesting projects that we'll probably get into here in a moment. Thad, thank you for being on the show.
My great pleasure, Andrew. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So I have never read a book which is more pro-miscreant and pro-prostitute than A Renegade History of the United States. For people listening to the show, and I'm probably a little bit in this category, that are a little bit inhibited and repressed, what is the benefit to us of history's down-and-outs, renegades, and derelicts?
Nothing at all. That is.
Oh, okay.
That is, if you want to remain as you are.
Oh no,
if you want to, yeah. So if you want to remain repressed, if you want to remain a good American, upstanding citizen, then no, it does nothing for you. It's useless. In fact, I suggest that you burn it.
Well, it's on a Kindle, so I might microwave it. But
yeah, that's good. Yeah, that would be the new age tech version of book burning. I appreciate that. Yeah,
sure. Well, no, I read it, and I do think it's a really novel way of looking at history. As I mentioned in the introduction, I think, and I could be wrong, but I think that the lens you're kind of looking at events through is this Libertines versus disciplinarians, which is a perspective I hadn't really encountered before. And the impression I got was that in terms of developing rights and in terms of both cultural freedom and even legal freedom, it's generally the miscreants that are pushing the envelope.
Right. Yeah, exactly. No, you really nailed it. That's actually a beautiful synopsis of the argument, which is that the book is simply about people who in American history have done things they weren't supposed to do, which could be either a violation of a law, a written law, or it could be a violation of just a social norm. And so we have, in my book, we have, like you mentioned, prostitutes. We have, obviously, they're violating both the law and social norms. By doing so, though, they made a whole bunch of money, right? Because not a lot of women were willing to do that. So there was very little supply, but lo and behold, there was always a whole lot of demand, especially in the 19th century with these Western towns full of these coal miners or silver miners or gold miners or cattle rustlers, right? And so these women could demand pretty much whatever price they wanted. They attained tremendous wealth. They gained property. They were the wealthiest and most powerful women in all of the United States in the 19th century. And when they had that much wealth and that much power, what did they do with it? They gained their own freedom. So they wore what they wanted. They wore what they wanted to wear. They wore makeup. They were the first women to wear makeup. They were the first women to color their hair. They were the first women to show any skin between the chin and the toes in American history. All these things that all women now take for granted. They were the first women to walk the streets alone without a male chaperone. That was really not something that a respectable lady did in the 19th century, but the whores did. They were the first, they were the pioneers of all these things that women now take for granted. So I say, put the prostitutes, put the whores on Mount Rushmore.
You know what? I would definitely go to a monument that had prostitutes and say bootleggers or something like that. I would enjoy looking at that. You brought up boomtowns a moment ago, and it made me think. I had always sort of thought of the West and pioneers going out to make their own as largely an economic phenomenon. But in reading your book, I didn't realize how stifling culture could be in the United States, particularly during the Victorian period. And I could see a number of people just going nuts to this. I'm going out west where there's no laws, and going to some environment that was very, tombstone, very adrift from all of the social mores that might otherwise be stifling. Okay,
good. I'm glad. This is one of the best interviews I've ever had about this book.
Thank you.
I'm not kidding you, and I've had hundreds, because you're nailing really important points that often don't get covered, and this is a really crucial turning point. So you talk about the Wild West, and I was just talking about how great it was for prostitutes in the Wild West. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners at this point, however many minutes this is into the interview, are thinking, well, hold on now. The Wild West was also full of a bunch of dudes with guns shooting each other, wasn't it? It wasn't just women getting rich and powerful, and that's absolutely true. While the Wild West, the so-called Wild West of the 19th century, was relatively lawless, that's true. And that meant a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. So the argument in my book is not that we should just have a lawless society like that necessarily, or I should say a society in which people like prostitutes and drunks and criminals, the other heroes in my book, run things. We don't want that. What I'm saying is what we want is, so long as that there are sheriffs and deputies And then, of course, later on, a bigger government and all these moral guardians and missionaries and evangelical Christians who would go around telling people how to live. So long as we have a society full of those moral guardians, I want to stay more or less on the side of the renegades, the people who want to violate those norms. So I'm not calling for a Wild West kind of society. Mm-hmm. I'm simply saying that in those societies, there are people, there are behaviors that I think we can learn from. Not only that, but that we have directly benefited from.
Well, I'll say one of the things that I found really interesting in the book is that kind of moral repression undulates in American history. I think a lot of the time we tend to view, prior to reading this book, I would have looked back on the American colonial period where, presumably everybody's a Puritan or thereabouts. And no, in fact, there's all sorts of different moral outlooks and a lot of license going on. One of the things I was kind of curious about, am I right in thinking that we are very puritanical in the, say, 17th century and around the Second Great Awakening, but then kind of around the actual American Revolution, we've got this sort of nadir of moralism, and then it swings back in with Victorianism? Am I was there that kind of lull there around the time of the founding of the country?
Yeah, undulation is another interesting idea. Yeah, I guess so. When I think about, I hadn't thought about it this way, but yes, the book begins, or I should say, the story, the Renegade story, and this is in the book, begins right with Plymouth Rock, mm-hmm. with the pilgrims on that ship, who are mostly Puritans.
Right.
They get off, they establish this colony that's puritanical, there is no fun allowed whatsoever, but there were some other people on other ships from England who came over at the same time who were not Puritans, who were very interested in drinking whiskey and dancing with the Indians. Mm-hmm. And they went off and established their own colony right up the road from Plymouth, and it was called Marymount. And the very first war in American history, not U.S. history, but American history, was when the people of Plymouth established a militia to march on Marymount, wipe out the Indians, jail all the founders of that colony, ban whiskey, and ban dancing. So the Civil War, this cultural civil war between the moral guardians of order against the libertines and the hedonists began right when they stepped off the boat.
Okay. But it does kind of ebb away for a while. Like one of the things you point out is that there's a kind of the term is benign neglect, and that's usually applied to sort of the colonies at large when they're under the crown and they're a colony of Great Britain. But one of the things was that the crown and Parliament did not want to legislate divorce laws, and so there's a period where a lot of the things that become fairly established social mores, like you can't leave a bad marriage or anything like that, are really kind of up in the air at the time of the founding of the Republic.
Yep. So what happens is, for a time, the Puritans basically hold sway in New England. So New England, for many, many decades in the 17th century, is essentially puritanical in its laws and in its dominant mores. But then in the 18th century, meaning in the 1700s, 1710, 1720, 1730s, these really terrible things emerge in the American colonies known as cities. Philadelphia was, by the time of the Revolution, chock full of brothels and saloons, which had black women servicing white men and white women servicing black men, and Indians and poor Irish people dancing with blacks and inventing the jig. The jig dance was invented in these low-class saloons in Philadelphia and New York during that time. The cities, by the time of the Revolution, had grown to such a size that the Puritans couldn't control any of it. The Puritans controlled the countryside in New England, but inside Boston and New York and Philadelphia, it was the world that you have talked about and we've been talking about now that was truly almost dominated by what we would call a demi-monde, although it was really, really above ground all the time.
Yeah, it sounded like something of a bacchanal in the cities. And you mentioned the cities. That was another thing that I had not considered until I read the book. Was there is this long-standing kind of rivalry or suspicion between rural people and city folk. I mean, that goes way back. That's pre-American. But the kind of the specificity of why because these cities are these melting pots of sin. And then extrapolating from that, and I want to clarify that I've got this right. Usually when we talk about voting being limited to landowners, it's presented in an economic capacity, that the founders wanted to set up a republic where only rich people could vote. And you're positing, I think, the thesis that no, it was specifically landowners, not rich people, but landowners, because the founders, who were of this kind of puritanical bent, as opposed to the common people, they wanted to make sure that it was farmers, very morally upright farmers, that were running the government, and not bankers or merchants or sailors.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was Jefferson's take in particular. I mean, that was precisely Jefferson's argument. He said that when you're a farmer, and this is totally true, you just don't have time to be drinking. Yeah. You don't have time to be running around with whores, et cetera. But the founders, almost to a man, were puritanical publicly. I mean, they drank like fish.
Right.
They drank like fish, like all Americans, although actually there's evidence that all of them really curtailed their drinking after the Revolution and started drinking coffee. Which I think says everything about this. But yes, there was an argument that certainly a landed or propertied gentry, because of the responsibilities attached to that, because of the responsibilities attached to ownership, landowning, and all of it, yes, they did think that those kinds of people would be better citizens, and that's certainly true. If you've ever owned a business, whether it's a farm or a cobblery, right? You know that you're thinking about the business all the time.
Right.
And those people are the most disciplined people in our society. Are business owners, especially those kinds of small business owners, which is what most of them were at that time. So yes. Being employed, especially with that kind of responsibility, is the kind of person they were looking for.
Well, yeah, I didn't realize how much how much fretting the founders were doing about trying to keep people morally upstanding. Like Adams seems very intent on trying to design a republic that is eliminating credit, luxury, what he views as sort of effeminate additions to life and that kind of thing. And there's a quote you have in there. I can't pull it up off the top of my head, but basically it's that the idea that democracy itself, because it requires the individuals in it to be responsible for themselves, also has a component of moral responsibility built into it. And then that was part of the plan, was let's get rid of this monarchy because it's going to force people to take responsibility for themselves, at which point they'll quit being libertines.
Right. This is the argument in the book that's the most radical, maybe, and it's the one that Americans it's almost like I'm speaking Albanian to them when I'm trying to explain it, because it's something, ask an American why democracy is good. How many Americans do you think can give any kind of cogent answer that has anything in it to that question? I think they don't. It's basically a religion, right? This is not to say that in itself doesn't say it's good or bad, but we certainly are not taught to think about why democracy is good. We haven't. It's simply a religion. We bow to it. So here's why the founding fathers really liked it, and this is one of the reasons I don't like it. They understood this. They understood that managing things. We're talking about being an owner of a business or something like that. Mm-hmm. Being an owner of a country. Even being an owner, a mayor, not the owner, but the political owner in a sense, of a town or a village even, that requires tremendous work. So if the people are managing the town and deciding where the streets are laid and which houses get zoned where and where we get to have businesses and who gets to go to jail and who doesn't get to go to all these decisions, these zillions of decisions in every polity in the world, right? If you give it to the people will be so busy they can't go to the saloon. That was precisely the argument of John Adams. It's amazing, but people don't understand this. The argument, one of the principal arguments by the founding fathers was that democracy is in itself puritanical, because it requires so much work. You have to learn just about the place that you're managing, that you're governing. If you're truly democratic, right, you will know everything about the town you live in, won't you? And you'll participate in every meeting that matters about that town, every meeting to determine the future of that town. And that's just your town. You also live in the United States.
You're blowing my mind here, Thad.
If you're really going to be democratic and live in the United States, now you've got to know everything about the United States, and you've got to be participating in all the meetings in which there are major decisions being made in the United States. Now, I don't know about you, Andrew, but I don't have time to do anything else at this point. The more democratic I am, the less time I have to do anything that's fun.
I mean, I think the solution is to start serving liquor at city council meetings, and then we can do both. I'd be a lot more likely to run for office if that were the case. If I knew I was going to have a dedicated drinking night where I got to vote on stuff, that'd be pretty cool.
Well, it's funny that you say that. That is the central plank of our anarchist party. We do want that. We do want much more liquor in government offices. We think it would do some good for the country. No, but that was actually the argument that was being made by John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and the rest of them. And they made this explicit, and it's in my book in chapter 1. You'll see them saying precisely this. It creates virtuous citizens, is what John Adams said. Democracy creates virtuous citizens. You give them all this responsibility, you won't even have to police them. They'll police themselves. And he was right.
This kind of sounds like a mixed bag to me, because on the one hand, I'd prefer, like, I like personal responsibility. I like drinking as well. So it's like I'm not. I do want people to be responsible for themselves to the point where I don't have to be responsible for them. However, I also want to enjoy freedoms at the same time. So I haven't quite made up my mind on this one, Thad. You've knocked my brain sideways a little bit, but I like that feeling. I think cognitive dissonance is a healthy state to be in occasionally. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, you were kind of saying there's two arguments for being puritanical. One is what you were sort of saying there, which is like the libertarian argument, which is be self-restrained so that the state doesn't have to restrain you.
I think that's about where I am. Yeah.
Right. That's Ron Paul's argument. That's actually a very classical libertarian argument. Mm-hmm. That's different. That's different than this democracy. That's totally different, because the libertarians are anti-democracy too, but not for the reasons that I am. No, the democracy argument is that you should be the more democratic you are, the more you participate in the running of your own society, the more puritanical you must become. Right?
Yeah.
That's the difference.
So charting that impulse forward, you've got this puritanical / managerial impulse that's there at the founding of the country. Does that funnel into, say, like social conservatives? Does that funnel into? I mean, I think authoritarianism, I do not believe, is limited to any political party. So I could see that kind of managerial impulse also go through the progressive movement. I don't know. How do you see it fan out in terms of modern society?
Yeah, I mean, I think so any ideology that seeks state power is going to be authoritarian. It has to be, right? Okay. Because they presume to know what you and I need, right? Because that's seizing. The state acts for everyone, right, under its auspices. So if your ideology seeks state power in order to impose anything at all, I think, on the society, that means it's authoritarian, because you will be imposing things on people who do not want it.
Yeah,
go ahead. Yeah, if you're making any claims at all, to me, even if it's just in your mind, in a sense, if you're making any claims about what people you do not know want or need, I think you are an authoritarian person.
Okay.
That's an authoritarian thought. If you think you know what people you've never met need in their lives, you are having an authoritarian thought there. Right? Mm-hmm. That, to me, is the beginning of everything that ends up being very bad politically in this world.
Okay. Yeah, I think that authoritarian impulse definitely lends itself to that, although you framed it very well, of a presumption of knowledge on behalf of other people, oftentimes of lesser people, that tends to come into it.
So let me... Yeah. Can I expand on that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, go for it.
This is one of my favorite topics.
Yeah.
So, I mean... So this goes, so you're talking about classical conservatives, or you're talking about real conservatives, okay? Mm-hmm. And whether there's an authoritarian streak in them. Mm-hmm. There, of course, is, because they seek to impose the norms and sometimes the laws that are traditional within a particular locality, okay? classical conservatism going back to Edmund Burke.
Mm-hmm.
That's serious, real OG conservatism right there. But it's only attempting to impose those laws and norms on a locality. They make no claims for people they don't know, essentially, outside where they live. It's very localist in that way. It's almost environmentalist in that way too. And so, on the other hand, liberal internationalists, not the liberals of the 19th century, but the 20th century liberals of the new progressives.
Woodrow Wilson types.
Exactly, right. Them and socialists, of course, and communists, and certain fascists, but not usually fascists, but certainly socialists and communists. Who do they speak for? Do they speak for their village, their town? Do they speak for New York City? No, they speak for the entire world. They know what the laws should be for Bangladesh and Madagascar, as well as for the United States, don't they? Mm-hmm. Because that's what the United Nations has been all about since the beginning. That's what all of the foreign aid that the United States has been pushing out has been all about. That's what much of our military interventions have been all about, is about making all the rest of the world look a lot more like us. That's all been driven by liberals. That's not a conservative agenda at all. That's a liberal, progressive agenda. The neocons who did that for a little while, they all identify as Wilsonian, Woodrow Wilsonian progressives. They themselves identify that way.
Yeah, I think
so
go continue. Sorry.
So they're authoritarian. Just to finish, their authoritarianism is not local; it's global. That's the problem.
Do you see then the delineation between authoritarian conservatives and authoritarian progressives as one mostly of geographic expanse, or do you see it? I mean, I think based on the Burkean definition you were using a minute ago, that the authoritarian impulse is more legally bent for progressives, but more culturally bent for conservatives, or is it both?
Conservatism requires violence against youth. Progressivism requires violence against everyone. Conservatism requires violence against youth because youth are the ones who challenge tradition. So the youth are the ones who must be put down every generation in some way or another if we are going to preserve our tradition. Because as we all know, right? Anybody who's lived more than a generation knows that the youth always come along and screw things up, don't they? Because they want to change the old ways, and so they have to be squashed. So conservatism requires, and I mean actual, locking them up sometimes, or even sometimes killing them.
Sure. But
that's what juvenile detention is for, right? And that's in every society, or the cane, the whip, or whatever, right?
Okay.
But progressivism requires that everyone adhere to the same laws and norms. So it requires cutting off the heads, basically, of every culture that differs from one very, very particular culture, the one that was originated in Plymouth Rock in the 17th century. Mm-hmm. So, that's pretty serious. That's what progressivism is. It's an attempt to continue the extension of the Puritanism born in 1617 outward, all the way across the world.
Out of curiosity, you mentioned the anarchist party earlier. Are you an anarchist, Thad?
No. Well, no, I haven't yet.
Because talking to you, I feel like a very intense status. Like I said in the intro, and I enjoyed this about the book. Your book made me feel uncomfortable about how bougie and how apparently like sweater vest Norman Rockwell I am. Because normally I'm like, I'm doing cool stuff. I'm talking to people about psychedelics or whatever. And then I read the book and I'm like, wow, Thad is much more chaotic than I am.
So, okay, yes. If I am an anarchist, I am the only one.
Okay.
Because I've never met an anarchist who identifies as an anarchist who I agree with.
Okay. All right. But yeah, definitely. I'll say you're definitely anti-authoritarian. But I'll add to that, I don't feel like you're a cookie cutter in any group. I have a difficult time, and I won't really try to really nail you down because I think you're kind of your own phenomenon. But I think you probably like it that way. So we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I want to run through a couple of things in here. I think you got a little bit of flack for how you portrayed FDR in the book, because you see a lot of parallels between him and fascism, right?
Oh, gosh. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, it's funny to say that I got flack. I don't know. Did I get flack? I suppose so. I mean, the case is so airtight that I don't even care what they say, because everyone knows it who studied it. I am actually about the sixth. There's at least 5 or 6 professional historians who work at elite universities who have made the argument that I've made. Okay, so it's actually not even that controversial anymore, including a very prominent historian at Columbia, where I used to be. The parallels are just too numerous to get into here. But what I say in the book is that the New Deal was not fascist necessarily. Sorry. The New Deal was obviously not identical to the fascism of Italy or Germany, but they were absolutely very closely related. They clearly came out of the same intellectual framework. In fact, many of the ideas for the economic policies in Germany and Italy, and many of the actual racial and eugenics policies in Germany came from the United States.
Yeah, because we had our own eugenics program prior to that, yeah.
The economic model of fascism in Italy was precisely the economic model of the early New Deal and precisely the economic model of Nazi Germany, and that's not disputed. And that's it. It was a merging of government and big business, with government running big business, but allowing private property, to still allowing private property and profit. But if a banker wanted to do something the Nazi government didn't want them to do, the banker got his head shot off. Okay. So it wasn't a domination by capitalists. It was the state running things and letting big capital sort of manage things in the meanwhile. All 3 projects, the fascist regimes in Europe and the New Deal here, were intensely nationalistic. They also included cults of personality, very much so, around Roosevelt, Hitler, and Mussolini. And anyone who has studied the New Deal knows this about Roosevelt, that Hollywood was employed in this and devoting massive motion picture productions to basically glorifying the president of the United States in ways we haven't even seen under Obama. So the parallels are almost infinite, but I'll end with this. Hitler, the Nazi Party, and Mussolini were incredibly enthusiastic about the New Deal and Roosevelt, and wrote flowery encomiums to the glory of the New Deal and the great leader of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. They loved Franklin Roosevelt and considered him their brother, and they said this, and that's all in my book.
Okay. Well, before we wrap up, I want to go back to the beginning of it, because I really enjoyed the elements on colonial history, because it was so very different than kind of the more idealized 1776, the musical version that I'm familiar with. Since I get most of my history outside of Thad Russell from Broadway musicals, it's different. If we were to go back and we were to go hang out in like a seaport, a portside town with sailors and pirates and prostitutes and that kind of thing, and we as 21st century Americans were to talk about freedom and liberty, how would our understanding of freedom and liberty be different than one of these libertines hanging out in a tavern or a brothel back at the founding of the Republic?
Right. So the answer is I don't know, because the people in my book who are the renegades they don't speak. In other words, there's no record of any of their thoughts that are available. So all we know of is their behavior. And so I think that for historians, it is perfectly fine to make claims when you have evidence of people's behavior. You can say X number of people, you said, X number of people drank Y amount of whiskey, in gallons, right? That's perfectly fine. You can analyze that. And from that, you can adduce many things about a population. That's perfectly fine. When you don't know, when you have no record of their thoughts, meaning there's no words attached to their thoughts that they either wrote or were recorded by someone else, this is one of the worst acts of imperialism, and I see it all the time, everywhere, not just in the historical profession, but in social science, in politics, all the time. People say they know what others were thinking in the past when there's no written record, there's no record whatsoever of what they thought, right? So I don't know. Now, all I do know is that their behaviors were violating these norms that were restrictive and repressive and puritanical. And by doing so, they simply created these new spaces. They almost physically occupied these new spaces like saloons and brothels, right? And then later on jazz halls and nightclubs, and then later on rock clubs, and then later on hip hop dance parties, and then later on raves and all the rest of it, right? They occupied those spaces just by their behaviors, and then we all filled those spaces later on and made them respectable and normal, and thank God for them.
A wonderful note to end on. Unfortunately, because we're under studio restrictions, I have to end the interview. Thad, I could have talked to you about this for another couple of hours because I loved this. I loved this book. It was mind blowing for me. It definitely made me look at things different. Real quick before we leave, what are you up to now? I think when last I spoke to you, you were running various academic initiatives that I think were outside of the university you used to be at. What are you into at the moment?
I am, indeed. I have launched Renegade University. You can go to and see that on ThaddeusRussell.com. But very, very shortly, we're going to be launching a brand new platform for RU, Renegade University. That's coming out within weeks. It's very exciting. It's a blend of online courses and in-person seminars and lectures, and then in all sorts of events around North America and actually eventually the world. And then also I have my podcast Unregistered, which has been the greatest thing I've ever done in my life, Andrew. I have to say, it's really changed me, and it's the thing I am most proud of. So please check that out as well. You can find information about Renegade University and the Unregistered podcast at ThaddeusRussell.com.
Wonderful. Thank you, Thad.
Thank you, Andrew. This was great.
Little bit of listener feedback before we finish up. On iTunes, Keeping It Real in C says, fact and reason-based commentary enlivened with wit and toaster insurance. Why, thank you. You can watch this whole show on YouTube if you look for Something's Off with Andrew Heaton. You can see my handsome bearded face, an assortment of suits, and the dead bison head we screwed to the wall. Something's Off with Andrew Heaton is forged daily in the fires of Mount Doom by the Dark Lord Sauron, then packaged and shipped across the wastelands of Mordor to the nearest YouTube store for your viewing pleasure. So go to YouTube and start watching full episodes. I look like Gandalf, the really, really, really white, which I think is a reference to, we all know what he's talking about. I'm just white. Thanks, Jennings. Remember, you can always tweet me at Mighty Heaton or Facebook me at facebook.com/Mighty Heaton, or even email me by subscribing to my newsletter at mightyheaton.com and just replying when I send it out on Fridays. Finally, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. That helps other people discover this here political orphanage. Thank you, and good day.